She was embarrassed and forced out of her seat, but within minutes, the very flight attendant who had demeaned her faced consequences no one could have foreseen. What unfolded during this flight would alter not only the lives of those aboard, but also the trajectory of the airline itself. Before diving in, drop a comment below with your location. And if stories like this captivate you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring content. Ava Carter boarded the plane with a composed confidence that turned a few heads. She wore a fitted blazer over a sleek dress, her natural curls framing her face elegantly. In one hand, she carried a sophisticated leather laptop bag, and in the other, her boarding pass. Navigating the aisle with ease, Ava glanced at seat numbers, her expression calm and poised, yet with a quiet resolve that hinted she was someone who couldn't be easily unsettled. Arriving at her first-class seat, she offered a polite smile to the passenger beside her and stowed her bag in the overhead bin. Settling into her seat, Ava retrieved a small notebook and pen, focusing intently on jotting down notes, seemingly unaware of the occasional curious glances from nearby passengers. Not long after, Miranda Scott, a flight attendant, strode briskly through the cabin. Her uniform was immaculate, her demeanor sharp and watchful, as her eyes scanned the passengers. When her gaze landed on Ava, she paused. Something about Ava caught her attention, though it wasn't immediately clear what. With a slight tightening of her expression, Miranda approached, stopping at Ava's seat. "Excuse me," Miranda began, her tone polite but with a noticeable edge. "May I see your boarding pass, please?" Ava looked up, mildly surprised but unfazed. She handed over the pass with a small smile. "Of course," she replied evenly. Miranda studied the ticket, her frown deepening. "This is for first class?" she asked. "Yes," Ava answered calmly, her voice steady. "That's correct." Miranda hesitated, as though reconciling some internal doubt, before handing the boarding pass back without further comment. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and she moved away, her demeanor suggesting this matter was far from resolved. Ava, unfazed, shrugged off the interaction and returned to her notes, her pen gliding steadily across the paper. Meanwhile, Miranda conferred quietly with another flight attendant, her eyes occasionally darting in Ava's direction. Her tension was evident even from afar. It wasn't long before Miranda returned, this time exuding a more authoritative air. "Miss Carter," she said firmly, "could you step aside for a moment? I need to verify something." Ava blinked, her surprise evident, but her composure intact. Gathering her laptop bag, she followed Miranda toward the galley, her calm demeanor unshaken despite the whispers and curious glances from first-class passengers. Standing in the narrow space, Ava waited as Miranda squared her shoulders and spoke. "There seems to be a mistake with your booking," Miranda said, her arms folded. "I'm going to have to ask you to move to a different seat." Ava tilted her head slightly, her brow furrowing. "A mistake? That's unlikely. I booked this ticket weeks ago and received confirmation. Perhaps there's been an error on your end." Miranda's tone hardened. "I've already double-checked. This seat isn't appropriate for you. I need you to move to the main cabin." The words hung heavily in the air. For a brief moment, a flicker of disbelief crossed Ava's face, followed by annoyance, but she quickly masked her emotions. "I don't understand," she said calmly. "My ticket is valid. Why would I need to move?" Miranda stiffened, lowering her voice. "Either you move, or I'll call security to assist you." Ava's eyes narrowed slightly, but she nodded. Without a word, she returned to her seat to gather her belongings, her movements deliberate. The entire cabin seemed to be watching, murmurs rippling as she made her way to the economy section, escorted by Miranda. Passengers' stares followed her every step, some sympathetic, others indifferent. In the main cabin, Miranda gestured toward a cramped middle seat. Ava placed her bag beneath the seat and sat down, maintaining her poise despite the circumstances. Miranda walked away, her satisfaction thinly veiled, leaving Ava to settle into her less-than-ideal surroundings. Looking out the window, Ava's expression remained calm, but her thoughts were visibly racing, a mix of frustration and determination. Reaching into her bag, Ava pulled out her phone and began typing swiftly. After sending a message, A knowing smile played on her lips. She made a quick call, her tone low but resolute. "Hello, it's me," she began. "Something happened, and I'd like it addressed immediately. Yes, I'm still on the plane. No, there's no need to escalate. Yet, just be ready for my signal." Ending the call as swiftly as she'd started it, Ava placed the phone back in her bag, her calm demeanor unnervingly steady. Back in first class, Miranda moved through her duties with a sense of triumph, ensuring the comfort of the remaining passengers and maintaining an air of professionalism, unaware that her actions were setting the stage for an outcome she could never have anticipated. Miranda served passengers with precision, but her thoughts kept circling back to Ava. Something about the woman's unflappable demeanor unnerved her in a way she couldn't quite articulate. Though she believed she had acted appropriately, a persistent doubt gnawed at the edges of her confidence. Meanwhile, Ava, seated in the economy section, glanced up as a younger flight attendant approached. Clara, with her softer demeanor and kind eyes, carried a cup of water and a concerned expression. "Ma'am, is everything okay?" Clara asked gently, her tone tentative but sincere. Ava met Clara's gaze with a warm yet guarded smile. "I'm fine, thank you. Just a little mix-up, I suppose." Clara hesitated, sensing there was more to the story, but Ava's composed demeanor discouraged further questions. "Well, let me know if there's anything I can do for you," Clara said, placing the water on Ava's tray before retreating to continue her duties. As the plane hummed along its route, Miranda remained unaware of the subtle storm she had set into motion. Ava, on the other hand, was in complete control. She leaned back in her cramped seat, her fingers lightly drumming on the armrest as she gazed out the window at the endless expanse of clouds. Her calm exterior belied a mind that was racing with plans and precision. Ava was not the kind of person to allow an injustice to pass without response, but instead of reacting emotionally, she preferred a measured and deliberate approach, and her plan was already unfolding. 7 minutes passed before the cabin intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for flying with us today. We hope you're enjoying your flight. If there's anything you need, please let one of our crew members know." Ava's eyes shifted toward the front of the plane. Her expression remained inscrutable as she retrieved her notebook from her bag. Flipping it open, she wrote a single, decisive line before snapping it shut. Whatever her next move, it was clear she was ready to execute it. Around her, the cabin settled into a rhythm of quiet conversations, in-flight entertainment, and the occasional rustle of snack wrappers. Passengers seemed largely unaware of the tension simmering just beneath the surface. Miranda, now more at ease, moved efficiently through her first-class duties, serving drinks and addressing passengers with a professional smile. To her, the situation with Ava was resolved, a minor hiccup that was now firmly in the past. Yet, the past wasn't so easily forgotten. Unbeknownst to Miranda, Ava's calm was not a retreat, but a calculated pause. Ava leaned forward in her seat, unlocking her phone. Her fingers hovered over the screen for a moment before typing a succinct, cryptic message. "They'll call soon. Let me know when it's done." She hit send, the faint glow of her phone briefly illuminating her composed face. None of the passengers around her noticed the quiet act, their attention absorbed by their own diversions. Ava allowed herself a subtle smile, one that hinted at a deeper understanding of the situation than anyone around her could fathom. Up in the galley, Miranda approached Dennis, a seasoned flight attendant with decades of experience. Dennis, often a mentor to newer staff, had a reputation for his calm and pragmatic approach to handling in-flight issues. Miranda leaned closer, lowering her voice to ensure the conversation wouldn't carry. "Did you notice that woman earlier?" Miranda asked, her eyes darting briefly toward the economy cabin. Dennis raised an eyebrow. "Which one?" "The one I moved to economy," Miranda clarified. "She had a first-class ticket, but something about her didn't sit right with me. She seemed out of place." Dennis frowned, crossing his arms. "Out of place? What exactly do you mean by that?" Miranda hesitated, realizing the delicacy of her words. "It was just a gut feeling. Better safe than sorry, right?" Dennis's frown deepened, and his tone grew stern. "A gut feeling isn't a reason to bump a passenger, Miranda. Did she do anything wrong?" "No, but nothing." Dennis interrupted, his voice firm. "You'd better hope this doesn't come back to bite you. First-class passengers pay a premium, and the airline doesn't take kindly to mishandling them." Miranda opened her mouth to respond, but the in-flight phone buzzed, interrupting her. Dennis answered, his expression neutral as he listened to the voice on the other end. Moments later, his brows furrowed, and he handed the phone to Miranda. "They're asking for you," Dennis said, his tone carrying a mix of curiosity and warning. Miranda felt a chill run down her spine as she took the receiver. Her voice wavered slightly as she answered. "This is Miranda. CT." The voice on the other end was calm but authoritative. "This is the airline's executive office. We've received a direct complaint regarding an incident involving a first-class passenger. You'll need to provide a detailed report upon landing. For now, ensure all passengers are treated respectfully and refrain from altering seating arrangements without proper justification." Miranda's face paled. "Yes, of course," she stammered. "I'll handle everything appropriately." As she hung up, her hand trembled slightly. Dennis watched her, his expression unreadable. "What's going on?" he asked. "Nothing," Miranda muttered, though the nervous edge in her voice betrayed her. Her gaze flicked toward the economy cabin, where Ava sat calmly, her notebook resting on her lap. For the first time, Miranda felt a pang of unease. Ava remained composed, her expression unreadable. But as Miranda returned to her duties, Ava's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. The tide was beginning to turn, and Miranda was only starting to sense the storm that was heading her way. Despite her attempts to shake off the discomfort, the phone call lingered in Miranda's mind, a shadow she couldn't ignore. She forced herself to focus on her tasks, smiling at passengers as though nothing had happened, but deep down, she knew the matter was far from resolved. Passengers remained absorbed in their routines, while Miranda continued performing her duties with mechanical precision. Yet, no matter how hard she tried to focus, her gaze repeatedly drifted toward Ava. Seated in the main cabin, Ava exuded an aura of calm and control that was disconcerting. She flipped through the in-flight magazine leisurely, crossed her legs, and occasionally glanced at her watch. To the casual observer, she appeared unbothered, as though her day had proceeded without any disruption. But internally, Ava was several steps ahead, her strategy unfolding exactly as planned. Clara, the kind-hearted flight attendant from earlier, returned to Ava's seat, her demeanor a soothing contrast to Miranda's abrasive attitude. "Excuse me, ma'am," Clara said softly, her voice tinged with concern. "Would you like something to drink? Perhaps a snack?" Ava looked up, offering a polite smile. "Just water, please," she replied, her tone as warm as her expression. Clara nodded and returned promptly with a cup of water and a napkin. She placed them gently on Ava's tray table. "If there's anything else you need, just let me know," she added kindly. "Thank you, Clara," Ava said, her voice genuine as she glanced at Clara's name tag. Her gratitude wasn't just polite, it carried a sincerity that softened Clara's already compassionate gaze. Clara gave a small smile before stepping away, leaving Ava to her thoughts. From her station, Miranda observed the exchange, her unease deepening. There was something about Ava's poised and gracious demeanor that clashed with the narrative Miranda had constructed in her mind. Ava's calmness, her subtle authority, and the quiet respect she commanded from Clara. It all unsettled Miranda in ways she couldn't fully articulate. The nagging feeling of losing control began to gnaw at her confidence. Meanwhile, Ava sat back, her fingers idly tracing the rim of her water cup. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, a steady backdrop to the tension mounting between Ava and Miranda. Ava's phone buzzed quietly in her lap. Glancing at the screen, her expression remained impassive as she read the message. All set, they're monitoring. Sliding her phone back into her bag, she took a deliberate sip of water, each movement exuding a calm authority that contrasted with the growing unease radiating from Miranda. The subtle tension didn't go unnoticed by a few observant passengers. A man seated across the aisle from Ava leaned slightly toward her. "That flight attendant's been giving you a hard time, hasn't she?" he whispered, his voice low enough not to draw attention. Ava turned to him, her expression neutral but her tone steady. "It's nothing I can't handle," she replied softly. The man raised an eyebrow, as if sensing there was more to the situation, but chose not to press further. Ava returned her gaze to the window, the endless sea of clouds reflecting in her calm but calculating eyes. Inside, she felt a quiet satisfaction. The pieces were falling into place, and Miranda had no inkling of the consequences her actions were about to unleash. Back in first class, Miranda's discomfort continued to grow. Each passing minute felt heavier than the last, the weight of the earlier phone call pressing on her like an unseen force. She couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was brewing, something completely beyond her control. Her once confident stride had been replaced by jittery movements and frequent, anxious glances toward the main cabin. Every time she looked at Ava, the woman's unbothered demeanor seemed to amplify Miranda's growing paranoia. Dennis, noticing Miranda's restless behavior, approached her in the galley. "Everything okay?" he asked, his tone neutral but his eyes curious. "Yeah, fine," Miranda replied curtly, though her stiff posture betrayed her unease. Dennis wasn't convinced. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Look, Miranda, whatever's going on, you'd better hope you didn't mess with the wrong passenger. First-class flyers aren't amateurs. These people have connections." Miranda stiffened at his words but said nothing, instead busying herself by rearranging cups. Dennis's warning struck a nerve. Who exactly is Ava Carter? The question lingered in Miranda's mind, accompanied by a sinking feeling that she had severely misjudged her. At the same time, Ava's phone buzzed once more. She glanced down at the screen, her expression unreadable as she absorbed the brief message. Without a word, she slipped the device back into her bag and turned her attention to the view outside. Her movements remained calm and unhurried, a stark contrast to the storm brewing within Miranda. The tension between the two women wasn't lost on nearby passengers, who began whispering among themselves. Though no one spoke openly, the unease was palpable, rippling through the cabin like an undercurrent. Ava, however, remained unmoved, her outward calm masking a sharp awareness of the dynamics around her. Miranda's breaking point came when Dennis handed her a folded note in the galley. His expression was unreadable, but his tone carried a hint of gravity. "The captain wants to see you," he said quietly. "What? Why?" Miranda asked, her voice tinged with irritation and apprehension. Dennis shrugged, though his disapproval was evident. "He didn't say. Just go." Reluctantly, Miranda made her way to the cockpit. As she entered, the door closed behind her, sealing her off from the rest of the cabin. Captain Harris, a composed man in his 40s, turned to face her, his expression serious. The co-pilot glanced briefly at her before resuming his focus on the controls. "Miranda," the captain began, his tone calm but firm. "We've received another call from the executive office." Miranda's heart sank. "Sir, He held up a hand, cutting her off. "This is serious. The passenger you moved, Miss Ava Carter, isn't just any passenger. She's connected to the airline's board of directors. We've been instructed to ensure she's treated with the utmost respect for the remainder of the flight." Miranda's face drained of color. "I didn't know," she stammered. "I thought—" "Did you think," the captain interrupted, his voice growing sharper, "or did you assume? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you acted without cause. That's unacceptable." Miranda tried to respond, to defend herself, but the words caught in her throat. Captain Harris sighed, rubbing his temples before addressing her with measured authority. "Here's what's going to happen," he began. "You'll return to your duties and ensure no further incidents occur. Upon landing, you'll submit a detailed report to the ground team. Until then, do not approach Miss Carter unless absolutely necessary. Is that understood?" "Yes, sir," Miranda whispered, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "Dismissed," the captain said, nodding toward the door. Miranda left the cockpit with her mind racing. The weight of her error pressed heavily on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She returned to the galley where Dennis stood, his brows raised in silent inquiry. Ignoring his gaze, Miranda grabbed a tray of drinks, her hands trembling slightly as she prepared to serve the passengers. Her anxiety showed when she poured coffee for a first-class passenger, spilling a few drops onto the tray. Muttering a quiet curse, she quickly wiped the spill and forced herself to carry on. Meanwhile, Ava remained a portrait of calm. Seated in the main cabin, she moved deliberately and without haste. Her every action, from sipping water to glancing out the window, radiated a quiet authority. As Miranda passed through the aisle, Ava lifted her eyes, locking gazes with the flustered flight attendant for the briefest moment. There was no malice in Ava's look, only an unsettling calmness that made Miranda's pulse quicken. Quickening her pace, Miranda retreated to the galley, her composure cracking further with every step. For the first time in her career, Miranda felt utterly out of control, and she hated it. Leaning against the counter, she gripped its edge tightly, her breath uneven. The captain's words echoed in her mind. She's connected to the board. The statement was like a blow to her pride. Miranda had always trusted her instincts, but now they seemed to have betrayed her in the worst way possible. Dennis, sensing her distress, finished organizing the snack cart and approached cautiously. "Are you going to tell me what's going on?" he asked, his tone measured but probing. Miranda hesitated, then sighed. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "The woman I moved, she has ties to the board. The captain just told me." Dennis straightened, his expression shifting from mild curiosity to concern. "The board? Are you serious?" Miranda nodded, her face pale. "I didn't know. I don't know what I thought. She just didn't seem—" Her voice trailed off as she caught herself, realizing how damning her words sounded. "She didn't seem like what, Miranda?" Dennis asked, his tone sharpening. "Like someone who belongs in first class?" Miranda didn't respond. Instead, she turned away, pretending to busy herself with inventory. Dennis shook his head, a mixture of disappointment and disbelief evident in his expression. In the main cabin, Ava checked her watch. The flight was nearing its halfway point, but her demeanor remained unchanged. She reached into her bag, pulled out her phone, and typed a brief message. "Almost time." Sliding the phone back into her bag, she leaned back in her seat, her calm composure unwavering. The man seated across the aisle leaned slightly toward her. His curiosity had been piqued by the unusual tension surrounding Ava. "Are you sure you're okay?" he asked in a whisper. That flight attendant seemed pretty rattled earlier. Ava turned to him, her smile faint but reassuring. "I appreciate your concern," she said politely, her tone firm yet kind. "But everything is under control." The man nodded, though skepticism lingered in his expression. Ava's confidence was undeniable, leaving him to wonder if there was more to her story than she let on. At the front of the plane, Miranda worked to maintain her composure. She moved through the first-class cabin with a forced smile, checking on passengers and delivering drinks, but her mind churned with anxiety. Ava's calm, unwavering demeanor unnerved her more with each passing moment. There was something about the way Ava had handled the situation, her poise, her restraint, that Miranda found deeply unsettling. It wasn't just rare, it was powerful. As Miranda returned to the galley to prepare the next round of service, a chime echoed through the cabin. The captain's voice followed, calm and steady over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We'd like to thank you for choosing to fly with us today. Our flight is progressing smoothly, and we're on schedule for an on-time arrival. Please continue to enjoy your flight, and as always, don't hesitate to let our crew know if you need anything." The announcement was routine, but to Miranda it felt like a pointed reminder of her spiraling situation. She glanced toward the main cabin, her eyes once again landing on Ava. To her surprise, Ava met her gaze and offered a small, almost imperceptible nod. The gesture wasn't smug or confrontational, it was calm and confident, a quiet acknowledgement that sent a chill down Miranda's spine. Back in the main cabin, Ava remained composed. She checked the flight progress on the small screen in front of her seat and jotted down another note in her notebook, her handwriting precise and deliberate. From an outside perspective, her actions seemed mundane, but every movement carried a sense of purpose that was hard to ignore. Passengers seated nearby watched her with quiet curiosity, whispering among themselves about the poised woman and the tension she seemed to inspire. Miranda, meanwhile, couldn't escape the growing weight of her mistakes. The hum of the airplane engines seemed louder, the tension between her and Ava more tangible with each passing moment. As the flight pressed on, Miranda's every action felt mechanical, her mind clouded by unease. She avoided looking toward the main cabin, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Ava was orchestrating something just beyond her sight, a silent symphony of consequences waiting to crescendo. The air in the galley was heavy with tension as Miranda leaned against the counter, her arms crossed tightly. Her mind raced as Dennis, ever observant, decided to confront her. "You've been on edge ever since that call," he said, his tone low but firm. "What's really going on?" Miranda hesitated, her eyes darting toward the curtain separating the galley from the main cabin. "I told you already," she muttered, her voice defensive. "The passenger I moved has connections. Important ones." Dennis raised an eyebrow. "Important enough for the captain to get involved? That's more than just connections, Miranda. That's a warning. What exactly did you do to her?" "I didn't do anything," Miranda snapped, though the defensive edge in her voice betrayed her guilt. "She didn't belong in first class, and You assumed she didn't belong," Dennis interrupted sharply, his voice cutting through her excuses. "And now you're paying for it. Let me tell you something. People like that don't let things slide." Miranda clenched her jaw, her frustration bubbling over. "What was I supposed to do?" she shot back. She didn't seem like what? Dennis cut her off again, his tone hard and unrelenting. "Like someone wealthy enough to sit in first class? Like someone who deserves to be treated the same as every other passenger up there?" Miranda fell silent, her hands gripping the counter so tightly her knuckles turned white. Dennis sighed heavily, shaking his head. "You should have left her alone. Now, you've made a mess bigger than you realize." Dennis returned to his duties, leaving Miranda to grapple with the weight of her actions. A wave of panic swept over her as she glanced toward the main cabin. Ava remained seated, her notebook now tucked away, her expression calm but resolute. The faint smile that had previously graced her lips was gone, replaced by a quiet determination that only deepened Miranda's unease. A chime echoed through the cabin, pulling Miranda from her thoughts. Her heart skipped a beat, but it was only the signal for an incoming call to the galley phone. She hesitated before answering, her hands trembling slightly. "Galley, this is Miranda," she said, struggling to keep her voice steady. "This is the captain," the voice on the other end said firmly. "We've received another communication from the executive office. They've requested that Miss Carter be given full priority service for the remainder of the flight. Make sure she's comfortable and personally apologize for any earlier inconvenience." Miranda's breath caught in her throat. "Yes, sir," she managed to reply before hanging up. She stood frozen for a moment, the weight of the situation pressing down on her like a physical force. The order wasn't a mere suggestion, it was a directive she couldn't ignore. Summoning what little composure she had left, Miranda prepared to approach Ava again, but this time she knew the power dynamic had shifted completely. Whatever happened next, she was no longer in control of the unfolding narrative. Clutching a glass of sparkling water on a tray, Miranda stepped out of the galley, her hands trembling slightly. Her usual poise was gone, replaced by visible tension. Each step toward the main cabin felt heavier than the last, the weight of her earlier decisions bearing down on her. This wasn't just about delivering a drink, it was an unspoken acknowledgement that she had crossed a line. When she reached Ava's seat, Miranda hesitated, the tray quivering in her grip. Ava looked up, her expression calm and unreadable. The air between them felt thick as Miranda forced a smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Miss Carter," Miranda began, her voice softer than anyone on the flight had heard it before. "I wanted to personally apologize for any inconvenience you may have experienced earlier. It was a misunderstanding on my part." Ava tilted her head slightly, her gaze sharp but composed. "A misunderstanding?" she repeated, her voice quiet but firm. Miranda's forced smile faltered. "Yes, I didn't mean to disrupt your experience. Please accept this as a token of apology." She placed the glass of sparkling water on Ava's tray table, her hand trembling slightly. Ava regarded the glass for a moment before meeting Miranda's gaze again. "Thank you," she said simply, her tone neutral. "But I think it's going to take more than a drink to fix this." The words, though spoken softly, hit Miranda like a slap. She swallowed hard, her palms beginning to sweat. "Of course," Miranda stammered. "If there's anything else I can do to make this right, please let me know." Ava didn't respond immediately, Instead, she leaned back in her seat, studying Miranda with a calm intensity that made the flight attendant fidget uncomfortably. The silence stretched, each second amplifying Miranda's unease. Finally, Ava offered a faint smile, not one of satisfaction, but of quiet confidence. "I appreciate your effort," Ava said finally, her voice measured, "but I believe the airline will address this matter appropriately after we land." Miranda's stomach sank at Ava's words. The mention of the airline was a clear signal that Ava wasn't letting the incident go. I understand," Miranda murmured, lowering her eyes. "If you need anything else, don't hesitate to ask." Without waiting for a reply, Miranda turned and walked back to the galley as quickly as she could without breaking into a run. Her cheeks burned with humiliation, and her mind raced with the implications of Ava's statement. It was clear that the situation was far from resolved. Whatever was coming next was entirely out of Miranda's control. Ava, meanwhile, picked up the glass of sparkling water and took a small sip. Setting it back down on the tray table, her expression remained calm and unreadable. To the passengers around her, she appeared as composed as ever. But internally, Ava knew the tide had fully turned in her favor. The gears were now in motion, and the final act was approaching. Miranda leaned against the counter in the galley, her face pale and her breath shallow. Dennis observed her with a raised eyebrow, his curiosity finally breaking through the tension. "How did it go?" he asked, his tone cautious yet pointed. Miranda shook her head slowly, her voice barely audible. "She's not done. She's going to take this all the way." Dennis sighed, his expression grim. "I told you. People like her? They don't play games. You should have known better." Miranda didn't respond. She stared blankly at the curtain separating the galley from the main cabin, her mind racing. For the first time, she fully grasped the weight of her mistake. Ava Carter wasn't just another passenger. She was someone who commanded power far beyond Miranda's comprehension. Now, Miranda was paying the steep price for underestimating her. As Miranda remained frozen in thought, Dennis moved quietly around her, glancing her way occasionally, but saying nothing further. His silence spoke volumes. It was clear he understood the gravity of the situation better than she did. Miranda replayed the events of the flight in her mind, each moment like a sharp thorn pressing deeper into her chest. In her years with the airline, she had never felt so small, so vulnerable. Meanwhile, Ava closed her notebook with deliberate care, sliding it into her bag. She adjusted her posture, sitting tall and composed, her calm demeanor unshaken. The hum of whispered conversations reached her ears, but she ignored them, her focus unyielding. Every move Ava made was precise, as if preparing for the next step in her plan. The intercom chimed again, and this time the captain's voice carried a distinct authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin our descent shortly. Please ensure your seat belts are fastened and tray tables are in their upright positions. Cabin crew, prepare for landing." Passengers began shifting in their seats, adjusting belongings and fastening seatbelts. Clara, the attentive flight attendant from earlier, returned to Ava's row, her warm smile now tinged with unease. "Is there anything I can get you before we land, Miss Carter?" Clara asked softly. Ava shook her head politely. "Thank you, Clara. You've been very kind." Clara's cheeks flushed slightly at the compliment. "If there's anything you need, don't hesitate to ask," she said before stepping away. Ava's calm tone reassured her, but the tension in the cabin was undeniable. In the first-class section, Miranda moved stiffly, her motions robotic as she completed her final checks before landing. Her expression betrayed none of the chaos in her mind, though the captain's directive and Ava's composed yet commanding presence replayed endlessly in her thoughts. Dennis and the other attendants watched her carefully, sensing the storm brewing beneath her veneer of professionalism. As the plane descended through the clouds, Ava glanced out the window, the cityscape of their destination coming into view. Her fingers rested lightly on the armrest, her expression as poised as ever. Inside, she felt a quiet satisfaction. Every step of the journey had unfolded as planned, and she was ready for what came next. The plane touched down smoothly, and a collective sigh of relief swept through the cabin. Passengers unbuckled their seatbelts and retrieved belongings, their chatter filling the air. Yet, an undercurrent of tension lingered, especially for Miranda, who was acutely aware of Ava's presence and the impending repercussions. As the seatbelt sign turned off, Ava remained seated, unhurried in her movements. She reached into her bag and pulled out her phone, typing a brief message. "We've landed. Be ready." Sliding the phone back into her bag, she stood with measured grace, gathering her belongings. At the front of the plane, Miranda stood by the exit, her smile brittle as she thanked passengers. Each "thank you" felt heavier, her nerves fraying with every person who passed. When Ava finally stepped into the aisle, she moved with the same deliberate calm that had marked her every action. The remaining crew, including Clara and Dennis, exchanged subtle glances, their unease palpable. When Ava reached the exit, Miranda straightened, forcing herself to meet Ava's gaze. "Thank you for flying with us, Miss Carter," Miranda said, her voice faltering slightly. Ava paused, her expression neutral but her eyes sharp. "I'm sure we'll be in touch," she replied smoothly, her words carrying a weight that made Miranda's stomach churn. Without another word, Ava stepped off the plane, her presence leaving an unsettling void. Miranda stood frozen, her eyes locked on the open door. Dennis approached cautiously. "You okay?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Miranda didn't respond. Her chest tightened as she stared into the jet bridge, dreading what might come next. Her fears were confirmed moments later, when two uniformed security officers stepped onto the plane. Their commanding presence immediately silenced the remaining crew. "Are you Miranda Scott?" one officer asked, his tone firm but formal. Miranda's breath caught in her throat. "Yes," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need you to come with us," the officer stated. "We have some questions regarding an incident on this flight." The color drained from Miranda's face as the full weight of her actions came crashing down. Her legs felt like lead as the officers gestured for her to follow. Dennis watched in silence, his expression a mix of pity and resignation. Miranda's stiff posture betrayed her rising panic as she walked off the plane under the officer's escort. The remaining crew exchanged uneasy glances, the atmosphere thick with uncertainty. Ava's calculated moves had set into motion consequences Miranda could no longer control. And for the first time in her career, Miranda realized the full cost of underestimating the wrong passenger. Outside the gate, Ava stood still amidst the bustling terminal, her phone in hand. She watched Miranda being led away by security, her expression a mask of calm resolve. The message Ava had sent earlier had accomplished its purpose, setting events in motion precisely as she had intended. Without looking back, she turned and headed toward baggage claim, her stride steady and purposeful. Around her, the energy of the terminal was a sharp contrast to the weight of what had just transpired. Whispers rippled through passengers from the flight, but no one dared approach Ava, whose composed demeanor exuded authority. In the confined security holding area, Miranda sat in a stark, featureless room with a table and two chairs. The officers who had escorted her off the plane stood near the door, their expressions firm and unreadable. Miranda's mind raced, replaying the events that had led her to this point. Only hours ago, she had been a respected flight attendant, and now she was under investigation. The realization hit her with crushing clarity. This wasn't a misunderstanding, but the result of a deliberate and calculated response. One of the officers spoke, breaking the oppressive silence. "Miss Scott, we've been informed of an incident involving a first-class passenger on your flight. The airline's executive team has requested a full account of your actions." Miranda swallowed hard, her throat dry and voice unsteady. I don't know what this is about. I was just doing my job." The officer raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "According to reports, the passenger you removed from first class was Ava Carter. Are you aware of her position?" Miranda's chest tightened. "I didn't know at first," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "I only found out during the flight." The officer leaned forward slightly, his gaze unrelenting. "Miss Carter is not only a high-ranking executive affiliated with this airline, but also a significant shareholder. Her complaint has already reached the board, and allegations of bias and mistreatment are being taken very seriously." Miranda's face turned ashen, her mind spinning. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. The officer continued, his tone growing more pointed. Miss Carter's account of the events has been documented, and additional passengers have corroborated her version. We are giving you the opportunity to provide your side of the story. But let me be clear, this matter will not be taken lightly. Miranda's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the table. She wanted to defend herself, to justify her actions, but every explanation felt hollow before it even formed. Deep down, she knew the truth. She had made a snap judgment, a prejudiced assumption, and now she was facing the consequences. Meanwhile, at baggage claim, Ava stood near the carousel, her phone pressed to her ear. Her voice was calm, but carried a note of finality. Yes, she said. The security team has taken her in for questioning. Ensure that the board reviews all footage and statements. I want this matter resolved professionally, but thoroughly. She paused, listening to the person on the other end of the line. Thank you. And please send a copy of the final report to my office. This cannot happen again. Not to me, and not to anyone else. Ending the call, Ava waited as the first luggage began to emerge on the conveyor belt. She reached for her sleek black suitcase, lifting it effortlessly. Around her, a few passengers from the flight watched, with a mixture of curiosity and respect. Ava paid them no mind, her focus already on the next steps. The chaos of the terminal swirled around her, but Ava moved through it with an air of unshakable purpose. What had begun as a moment of humiliation had transformed into an opportunity to demand accountability and enact systemic change. Back in the holding room, Miranda sat frozen, her breathing shallow. The silence stretched on, suffocating and heavy. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. I didn't mean for this to happen, Miranda began, her eyes darting between the officers. I was just following protocol. I thought she didn't belong in first class. The officer closest to her leaned forward, his expression sharp. And what exactly made you think that? Miranda hesitated, her lips parting as though to answer, but she stopped herself. The real reason, her unconscious bias, was something she couldn't admit. I don't know, she stammered. She didn't act like the other passengers in first class. The officer exchanged a glance with his partner before replying, his tone firm. Not acting like the other passengers isn't a justification for removing someone from their seat, especially when their ticket was valid. Did Miss Carter break any rules? Did she violate any airline policies? Miranda shook her head, her palms damp with sweat. No, but the officer cut her off. Then you acted without cause. Miss Carter was within her rights to remain in the seat she paid for, and your actions have placed the airline in a very difficult position. Miranda felt the weight of his words sink in, each one like a blow to her already fragile composure. Her heart raced as she struggled to process the full gravity of the situation. She had thought she was simply enforcing protocol, but now she realized she had overstepped, and the repercussions were far-reaching. At baggage claim, Ava took a sip from a bottle of water she had purchased, her calm expression betraying nothing of the storm she had orchestrated. The situation was now entirely in the airline's hands, but Ava's influence was undeniable. Her poised response to the incident had set a powerful example, not just for those who had witnessed it, but for an industry that too often overlooked its blind spots. The story of what had unfolded on the flight would ripple through the airline, the staff, and beyond. For Ava, it wasn't just about personal justice. It was about ensuring no one else would face what she had endured. As she exited the terminal, suitcase in tow, she felt no need to look back. The reckoning was already in motion, and her message was clear. Respect wasn't optional. It was non-negotiable, the weight of regret pressing down on her like an anchor. Sitting alone in her car, Miranda's hands trembled against the steering wheel. Her career, her confidence, and her reputation, all of it, seemed to be slipping through her fingers because of one pivotal moment of poor judgment. She thought of Ava Carter's calm demeanor, the composed way she had handled every interaction, and the unwavering control she had maintained from start to finish. It was undeniable. Ava had orchestrated the situation with precision, ensuring that accountability would follow. Meanwhile, Ava had arrived at her office, a sleek and modern building nestled in the heart of the city. The polished glass doors reflected the bustling streets outside. As her driver opened the car door for her, Ava stepped out gracefully, smoothing the hem of her dress with the same precision she applied to every aspect of her life. Inside, her assistant, Maya, greeted her with a warm smile and a stack of documents. "It's all here," Maya said, handing over a thick folder. The board's initial review of the incident, statements from the crew, and their plans to revise training programs. They've moved quickly. Ava nodded, flipping through the papers with an analytical eye. "They know this can't be swept under the rug," she replied, her voice calm but firm. "They're protecting their interests, which is expected, but this is a step in the right direction." Maya hesitated, her brows furrowing slightly as she considered her next words. "Do you think she'll fight back? The flight attendant, I mean?" Ava closed the folder and placed it neatly on her desk, her gaze thoughtful. "Maybe," she said after a pause, "but this isn't about her anymore. It's about the system that enabled someone like her to feel comfortable making decisions rooted in prejudice. That's what needs to change." Maya nodded, admiration evident in her expression. "You've already made a significant impact. The board is taking this seriously because of you." Ava offered a small smile but didn't respond. Her focus was already shifting to the broader issue at hand. She knew that systemic change required persistence, patience, and strategic action, qualities she possessed in abundance. Ava was determined to ensure that this incident wasn't just a footnote, but a turning point in the airline's policies and practices. Back at the airport, Miranda finally mustered the strength to leave the holding room. Her legs felt unsteady as she walked through the corridors, avoiding eye contact with the officers and staff who had witnessed her downfall. Each step toward the employee exit felt heavier than the last, a painful reminder of the career that now hung by a thread. Reaching her car, Miranda collapsed into the driver's seat, her uniform feeling like a symbol of everything she had lost. She stared at the steering wheel, her mind spinning with memories of the day's events. She thought about how she had once prided herself on her instincts, her ability to handle any situation. Yet today, those same instincts had betrayed her. She had misjudged Ava Carter. Not just her position or power, but her character. For the first time, Miranda allowed herself to confront the truth of her actions. She had made assumptions based on prejudice, and those assumptions had led her to a decision she couldn't take back. Ava had remained composed, dignified, and resolute throughout the ordeal. Even when faced with humiliation, she hadn't retaliated out of anger. Instead, she had sought justice and accountability, a response that Miranda could only admire, even as it unraveled her own career. In that moment of clarity, Miranda realized that Ava's calm, controlled demeanor had been her greatest strength. Ava hadn't lost control for a second. She had been in charge from the moment Miranda's first mistake was made, and now the repercussions of that mistake were rippling outward, affecting not only Miranda, but the entire airline. Ava, seated in her office, exhaled quietly as she set the folder aside. She gazed out the window at the city skyline, her mind steady and clear. The day had been exhausting, but it had also been necessary. Ava knew that change rarely came easily or without resistance, but she felt a deep sense of satisfaction knowing that she had stood her ground. More importantly, she had ensured that this incident would lead to lasting reform. Her phone buzzed, pulling her attention back to the present. It was another message from the airline's board, confirming their commitment to a full review of the incident and the implementation of new sensitivity training for all staff. Ava read the message carefully, her lips curling into a faint smile of satisfaction. She responded with a single line, "Good. Let's ensure this never happens again." As the city lights began to flicker on, Ava leaned back in her chair, allowing herself a moment of reflection. This chapter was closing, but she knew her work wasn't done. Real change required vigilance, and Ava was prepared to see it through. Drive away from the building fast enough. Shame and regret swirled in her chest, heavier with each passing moment. The reality was undeniable. Her actions on that flight had led her to this breaking point. Miranda's mind raced as she replayed every decision, every assumption, and every moment she could have chosen differently. But it was too late. The damage was done, and the consequences were no longer in her control. Meanwhile, Ava Carter stood in the middle of her office, her hands resting lightly on the desk, as she gazed out the large window. The city skyline was alive with motion, but her focus was unwavering. The meeting with Richard Hale had gone as she had anticipated. Firm apologies, commitments to action, and the undeniable weight of accountability. But for Ava, this was not about a single meeting or a solitary victory. This was about rewriting an organizational narrative that had been broken for far too long. Maya stepped into the office, a cautious yet curious look on her face. "The meeting seemed productive," she said, her tone more of an invitation than a statement. "Do you think they'll follow through?" Ava turned, her expression calm but purposeful. "They will," she said firmly. "Not because they want to, but because they have no choice. Accountability is no longer optional." Maya nodded, her respect for Ava evident. "What's next?" Ava picked up a folder from her desk, her movements deliberate. "Next," she said, "we ensure that the changes they've promised are implemented. This isn't the end. It's the beginning." The sun outside cast long shadows across Ava's desk as she returned to her chair. Opening the folder, she reviewed the detailed timeline she had demanded from Richard earlier. Each point represented not just a commitment from the airline, but also a reminder of what she had endured to reach this moment. For Ava, this was personal, but it was also so much more. It was about setting a precedent and creating a ripple effect that could transform an industry. Across town, Miranda sat in her small apartment, staring at the letter she had received earlier that day. The words blurred before her eyes, but their meaning was clear. Her employment with the airline had been terminated effective immediately. She dropped the letter onto the table, her hands trembling. The weight of her actions was finally sinking in, and with it came a gnawing realization. This wasn't just about losing her job. It was about confronting the biases and assumptions that had led her to make that fateful decision. The quiet of her apartment was interrupted by a notification on her phone. It was an article, one that detailed the airline's recent commitment to mandatory bias training and systemic reform in response to an incident involving a first-class passenger. Miranda felt her stomach twist as she read Ava Carter's name. The article painted a clear picture of the changes Ava had championed and the broader impact her actions would have. Miranda set the phone down, the words lingering in her mind. Ava's calm, composed approach had dismantled not just Miranda's career, but also the flawed systems that had enabled her to act as she had. There was no malice in Ava's actions, only precision and determination, a stark contrast to Miranda's own decisions on that flight. For the first time, Miranda felt not just regret, but a deep sense of accountability. Back at Ava's office, Maya entered again, this time holding a small stack of documents. "These just came in," she said, setting them on Ava's desk. "Initial reports from the first wave of sensitivity training sessions. Looks like they're moving quickly." Ava skimmed the reports, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "Good," she said. "Let's keep them moving. Change isn't about speed. It's about consistency." As the day turned into evening, Ava's office grew quiet. The work was far from over, but the foundation had been laid. She allowed herself a moment of reflection, thinking back to the flight and the moment she had been asked to leave her seat. That moment of humiliation had been the spark for something much larger. It wasn't just about her. It was about ensuring no one else would have to endure the same treatment. Ava stood, gathering her things as she prepared to leave for the day. Maya looked up from her desk, a question in her eyes. "Heading out?" "For now," Ava replied, her tone calm but resolute. "But this is just the beginning." With that, she stepped into the elevator, ready for the next phase of her journey. A journey not just of justice, but of transformation. The quiet hum of the room filled Miranda's small apartment as she sat staring at the termination notice on her table. Her thoughts swirled with regret and self-recrimination. For the first time, she fully felt the weight of her actions, not just the career-ending consequences, but the personal harm she had caused Ava. Miranda wanted to blame the system, her instincts, or the pressures of her job, but deep down, she knew the truth. The choice had been hers, and now she was living with its fallout. Across the city, Ava Carter sat in her sleek office, a cup of tea resting beside her laptop. The email from the airline's board reflected their urgency to repair the damage. Attached was a detailed timeline of the reforms Ava had demanded: mandatory bias training, updated complaint protocols, and an overhaul of their first-class policies. The changes represented a significant step forward, and for a moment, Ava allowed herself to feel a quiet sense of accomplishment. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from her assistant, Maya. "Miranda Scott has been officially terminated. Thought you'd want to know." Ava set her cup down, her eyes lingering on the message. The news didn't bring her satisfaction, nor did it feel like a victory. She wasn't vindictive by nature, and while Miranda's dismissal was a necessary consequence, Ava saw it as a symptom of a much larger problem. She typed a quick response. "Thanks for letting me know. Let's keep focusing on the bigger picture." Leaning back in her chair, Ava reflected on the whirlwind of the past 24 hours. Her actions hadn't been driven by anger or personal revenge. Instead, they had been fueled by a desire to create meaningful change for herself and for others who might face similar injustices. The reforms she had fought for were only the beginning, but they were a start, and that mattered. In her apartment, Miranda sat in front of her laptop, the glow of the screen casting shadows across her face. She had spent hours replaying the incident in her mind, searching for justification for her actions, but there was none. Her assumptions, rooted in bias, had led her down a path she couldn't undo. Friends and family had reached out, their messages filled with sympathy or quiet judgment, but Miranda couldn't bring herself to respond. She felt isolated, trapped by the weight of her mistakes. Turning on the TV, she hoped for a distraction, but fate had other plans. A news segment about workplace bias filled the screen. As if orchestrated by the universe, Ava Carter appeared on the broadcast, speaking eloquently about the importance of accountability and systemic reform. Ava's calm demeanor and clear words were a stark contrast to Miranda's turmoil. For the first time, Miranda saw Ava not as an adversary, but as someone who had every right to demand better for herself and others. Miranda turned off the TV and sat in silence. The room felt oppressive, but a small spark of determination flickered inside her. She couldn't undo the past, but maybe she could begin to make amends. Opening her laptop, Miranda started typing an email. It was addressed to the airline's board, and, indirectly, to Ava Carter. For the first time in days, her focus wasn't on defending herself, but on taking responsibility. The email began simply, "Miss Carter, I owe you an apology." Miranda acknowledged her actions, admitting to assumptions that had led her astray and the harm they had caused. She apologized not just for the disrespect she had shown, but for failing to see Ava as a person deserving of dignity and fairness. Miranda wrote candidly about how the aftermath of the incident had forced her to reflect on her biases, and how she planned to educate herself moving forward. The message ended with, "This experience has been humbling, and I've come to understand that the changes you're advocating for are desperately needed, not just in this airline but everywhere. I hope my actions, though wrong, can serve as an example of what must change. I am committed to learning and ensuring I never make this mistake again. Thank you for holding me accountable." A week later, Ava sat at her desk when Maya forwarded an email with the subject line, "Apology from former staff." Ava opened it, her curiosity piqued. As she read Miranda's words, she noted the tone of sincerity. The email didn't feel like an attempt to salvage a reputation, but rather a genuine acknowledgement of guilt and a commitment to growth. Ava debated for a moment before drafting a brief reply. "Thank you for your message. Accountability is the first step toward growth. I hope you continue on this path and use this experience to create positive change." She hit send and leaned back, her thoughts swirling. The incident wasn't just about personal justice. It was about creating ripples of change. Miranda's apology didn't erase what had happened, but it hinted at something important: the possibility of transformation. For Ava, It was a small step, but she knew that even the smallest steps could lead to something greater. Weeks had passed, and the ripple effects of the incident on Flight 287 were being felt far and wide. The airline had officially launched its first series of mandatory sensitivity and bias training sessions for all staff. Alongside this initiative, a public statement of accountability was issued, emphasizing the company's commitment to creating a more inclusive culture. Ava's role in advocating for these changes was acknowledged subtly but respectfully, presenting her not as a disruptor, but as a driving force for progress. The industry was paying attention. Other airlines began reevaluating their policies, and several reached out to Ava, seeking her guidance on implementing similar reforms. While she appreciated the outreach, Ava declined most offers, focusing her energy on ensuring the changes within her airline were fully realized. For Ava, this work was never about personal recognition. It was about making an enduring impact. One afternoon, Ava found herself back at the airport, preparing to board a flight for a business meeting. As she approached the gate, she noticed something different. The atmosphere felt lighter, and there was a noticeable shift in the way the staff interacted with passengers. Smiles were warmer, questions were met with patience, and the overall tone was one of genuine care. While it wasn't perfect, no system ever was, it was undeniably better. Progress, Ava thought to herself, was a journey, not a destination. When she reached the gate, the agent greeted her warmly. "Miss Carter, welcome back. We've upgraded your seat as a token of our appreciation for your continued support," they said, their tone sincere. Ava smiled, appreciating the gesture but politely waving it off. "That's very kind of you, but I'm fine where I am," she replied. Her humility and confidence combined effortlessly, commanding respect without ever demanding it. As Ava boarded the plane, she noticed subtle but impactful changes in how the crew carried themselves. Their interactions with passengers were attentive and purposeful. Taking her seat, Ava watched as a young woman across the aisle struggled to find space for her bag in the overhead compartment. Without hesitation, a flight attendant stepped in, offering assistance with a warm and reassuring tone. The scene brought a faint smile to Ava's lips. It reminded her of Clara, the flight attendant who had shown her kindness during her ordeal. Ava had made sure to highlight Clara's professionalism during her discussions with the board. And Clara's contributions hadn't gone unnoticed. She had since been promoted to a senior role. Ava spotted her near the front of the cabin, overseeing the boarding process with a steady and confident demeanor. Their eyes met briefly. Clara smiled, a look of gratitude passing between them. Ava returned the gesture with a subtle nod, an unspoken acknowledgement of mutual respect. It was moments like these that reminded Ava why she had fought so hard for change. Small acts of kindness, when multiplied, had the power to transform entire cultures. As the plane ascended into the sky, Ava leaned back in her seat, reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this point. It wasn't just about this flight. It was about the decisions and changes that had followed. She thought about Miranda's apology, the systemic reforms the airline had committed to, and the countless messages of support she had received from strangers who resonated with her story. It was both humbling and empowering. Elsewhere in the city, Miranda was embarking on a journey of her own. After leaving the airline, she had joined a nonprofit organization focused on workplace diversity and inclusion. Her experience with Ava had become a case study, fueling discussions about bias and the importance of accountability. Miranda knew she had a long road ahead, rebuilding trust and proving her sincerity, but for the first time, she felt a deep sense of purpose. This was about more than redemption. It was about contributing to a greater cause. Back on the plane, cruising at 30,000 feet, Ava pulled out her notebook and flipped to a blank page. She wrote a single line: "Change begins with accountability, but thrives on persistence." Closing the notebook, Ava allowed herself a rare moment of peace. She gazed out the window at the endless expanse of clouds, feeling a quiet sense of hope. The events of Flight 287 had been painful, but they had sparked something much larger than her, a movement toward fairness, empathy, and progress. As she watched the horizon stretch endlessly before her, Ava felt certain of one thing: the sky wasn't the limit. It was only the beginning. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. See you in the next one.